presentation. In fact, most of them already know me. And I have to say that when I was invited for this speech, and the organizing told me, yeah, we would like to hear something about the different evolutionary stage, I start to talk about, and my mind start to work, what to present. And so I went to the previous studies, previous reading I did at the beginning of my career, more than 30 years ago. And I reprise all these important scientific papers that, from which I start in studying such a landslide. It was the mid-80s, and at that time, even in Italy, there was a growing interest in the large-scale landslide. So the outline of my presentation will give some Holocene landmarks just to understand what we are dealing with. And then we move to the pioneering studies that I would like to share with you. Because going into this past literature, I mean, going back to the 50s, I understand that most of the concepts that they express in that studies is actually very current. And so then I would like to go into not such a detail, but in the bipolar, as already stated by Michel, the formation or landslides, creep or failure, brittle behavior or ductile behavior, fragile or plastic behavior. So there is two poles in between of which we have all the stage of an evolution of a slope. So the slope starts to deform and then fail. And then I would like to pose on the table some unsolved question and share some case of evolutionary, different evolutionary stage of landslide. Just to see what is a large-scale landslide. This is one of the largest landslides in the world, occurring in the Holocene. This is a side Mare landslide in northwest Iran. Is aged by almost 10,000 years BP, and the volume is 20 billion of cubic meter. So you see here clearly the landslide scarp that is very well correlated with the fault that is running in here. And this is the accumulation, very, very huge accumulation. Another important landslide, I mean, in the Alps, is the Flims landslide. It was studied for the first time by Albert Heim, already cited by Michel before, in 1882. And he recognized this type of landscape, very, very articulated and with a lot of debris, you see. And so he discovered a big scarp here and a very huge landslide. This seems to be the largest landslide in the Alps, dating more or less 10,000 years ago. And so after the retreat of the glaciers in the valleys. Then the other important landslide that I would like to show you is the Köfel. It's in Austria. And you see here is very clearly, the volume is 2.3 billion of cubic meters, and it was dated back 8,700 years BP. And you see here the scarp and then the accumulation. The interest on this landslide is very important because they found at the base some layer of pumice. And so this is not well explained yet, but the idea is what the pumice is the effect of the friction during the slide. But there are also some landslides occur under the sea. And so the use of this landslide is the Storegga landslide. Is one of the most studied landslide on the sea floor. Is order of magnitude bigger. It is 3,200 billion of square meter of cubic meter. You see here the coast of Norway, and the landslide is very, very huge. You see here the scale is 250 kilometers. So, of course, we are in a saturated environment, so the mobility of this material is much more than in the air. But here there is some images taken by a colleague of mine that is studying a submarine landslide in Malta, and is a multi-beam side-scan sonar that illustrates very well the dynamic of the processes. This is the upper scarp, of course, but the landslide have run out very, very long, as I said you before. But going to the pioneering studies, this is, I would like to introduce this engineer. It's very, very important for me. It's Professor Karl Terzaghi. It was a German and Austrian engineer that it was also a practitioner, not only a researcher, but also a practitioner. And his most famous paper written in the 1950s is The Mechanism of Landslide. In this paper, he takes into account the different type of landslide, different type of processes dealing to failure, and the dynamics of landslide. So it's a very, very well done studies. And I would like to show you some statements that he wrote in this paper. He defined a difference between landslide and creep. So it's the first time he mentioned a difference between deformation and movements. Then creep is nothing but a small scale and superficial replica of what takes place at depth. So it see that the mechanism is more or less the same of the tectonic movement, but a different scale, of course. Then he stated that the creep may develop into a slide, and the slide may be followed by a creep in the material, in the accumulation, of course. So we can have creep on the slope, but also on the accumulation. Then this statement is very nice, because he says that if a landslide comes as a surprise, it would be more accurate to say that the observer failed. So this means that we have always some precursory evidence which can induce us to consider the slope as unstable. Of course, the only case in which we don't have so much precursory signals is the earthquake-induced landslide. As we state during the field trip, in these 2 days field trip, we state several times that the earthquake is a forcing phenomena that could induce earthquake, could induce landslide without any type of evidences before. But the main intuition of Karl Terzaghi is this very simple graph. I mean, he stated that a slope decrease its state of stability all continuously due to predisposing or internal factor, but also due to triggering of external factor. So we have a progressive decreasing in the quality of the material and a progressive approaching of the slope to failure. So some occasional phenomena can decrease the factor of safety, like in this case. But when the slope is close to the factor of safety equal to 1, it's even a small triggering factor can produce the failure. And he was a practitioner, of course, and so he introduced in this work a lot of cases, not only on natural slope, but also on engineering slope. And so here is a progressive weathering failure slope, so a continuous decreasing is more or less like this one. Then we have a heavy rainstorm several years after the slope undercutting. So we have a decreasing factor of safety due to slope undercutting, and then a progressive failure. Then also it took into consideration some new slope or some recent slope or old slope exposed to unprecedented conditions, so liquefaction, seepage, and so on. But this is quite important graph that he is put on his work. You see here we have the factor of safety and the creep and the movements and against time here. So what is important here is the amount of displacement and time before failures depends on the thickness of the zone in which the state of stress approaches the state of failures. Of course, if we have a thin layer of deformation, like in this case, we can have a sudden movement, so this area is restricted both in time or in displacement. If we have a deformation that occur in a thick belt of zone, we can have enough time to see that the slope is moving and so take some action against. This image is taken by another important authors that I used to read on my early years. Is Ulf Zieschinski is also a German geologist that works in Vienna. Then he moved to a private sector. But at the time, he published a very, very important paper, Überzackungen, that is one of the most cited paper, but is in German, so very few people read it, even though they cited it. In any case, 3 years before, because this paper is from 1979, 3 years before, at the first International Conference on Rock Mechanics, took place in Lisbon, he published these papers in English on the deformation of ice slope, in which he presented already part of the material of Überzackungen. Here, in these papers, the authors put very important aspects on the deformation and ruptures, on the evolution of the slope in terms of creep and failure. He studied some cases in the Tyrolean Alps in Austria, especially in metamorphic rock. So from its geological survey, he stated that the foliation of the rocks was tilted down the slope at the base of the landslide. So he stated that the creep or flow of throwing rocks, of course, has an important role in the formation of ice slope, and the occurrence of basalt sliding plane is not essentially necessary for the deformation of the slope. So we don't need a failure surface completely developed in order to have a slope deformed. But we can have some deformation at micro scale, but not at micro scale. Then in the upper part of the slope, he stated that there were some shear planes in the top or even in the bottom. And it is essential that these planes do not cut through the wall body of the landslide of the slope, but hand downwards. So this means that in the upper part, as already mentioned before by Michel, in the upper part we can have shear planes, were very well developed, but not continuously below the slope. So this is important because these shear planes indicate failures within the body just visible at the scale of the deformed mass, but not continuously. So he stated that these two types of deformation, I mean shearing deformation and viscous deformation, can coexist in the same slope. And they are separated, of course, with respect to the confining pressure in which the process took place. And this is what some years later was highlighted by Marr in 1977. It was an important congress. I mean, the first time that most of the scientists dealing with such large-scale landslide convene and discuss together, and in which he clearly show how it is. Here at the base or at the top of the slope, we have shear plain, very well developed. But in the middle, we have also a shear ruptures, but not at the scale of the entire slope. This was a very important symposium, as I told you, and it's very, very important because scientists from Far East, from Europe and from US convene and discuss about landslide. One of the main topics of this conference was deep-reaching gravitational slope deformation. So they start to talk about large-scale landslide. And the panel was Professor Mar, that is a Czech scientist, that start to summarize the previous studies occurred in the eastern country, in the European eastern country. Professor Menkel was another eminent professor from the Czech Republic. At that time it was Czechoslovakia, now it's only Czech. And in 1968 he pointed out more or less the same concept. I mean, we have brittle deformation at the top of the slope and the base, where we have very few confining pressure, a very small confining pressure. And in depth, we can have ductile deformation. So shear, viscous, brittle, and ductile, creep, and landslide. So these two poles of the movement of a slope. And he also reprised an old scheme made by Feda in 1973, so an old scheme in which he summarized a little bit how a slope is going to deformate and before the failure. At the beginning, we have the appearance of a shear plane here at the top, and also at the base. But at the moment, we have only a small superficial deformation. But we have it anymore. Then other type of shear planes formed at the top of the slope, and the slope start to deform. You see here some bulging and some trench up slope. And then we have a completely deformed but not failed slope, because we have this type of rupture that occur at the top, at the base of the slope, but in the mid of the slope, so well in depth, we have an area in which we can have deformation and not rupture continuously. I mean, we have also rupture, but at the small scale, not at the big scale. So we have this both type of deformation behavior that can affect the slope in crystalline rock at different depth, as stated by Mar and Nemchok in that conference. So we can speak about sagging, so a slope that is going to modify but is not going to fail yet. But we can have also this both type of deformation on the sedimentary rock with different mechanical behavior. And this is the case of lateral spreading phenomena. This is one of these cases occurred in the East European country. So you see here, we were in 1977. 1 year later, this two volume is very important for us because Barry Voigt was an editor who put together a lot of case study, both in natural slope but also in engineering sites. Very important and nice case studies, but one of the section of these two big volumes was related to rock creep, scale effects, and related questions. So we are in a phase in which all the scientific community is recognizing the importance of rock creeps and the deformation and the scale effect on the slope behavior. So the last, the last paper I would like to share with you is a paper of 1997 of Dave Petley and Bob Allison, in which they try to summarize everything's written before, and by means of geotechnical testing on the London clays, they try to summarize how a deep-seated landslide can start and how is which is the mechanics of deep-seated landslide. And they state that, generally speaking, the deformation of rocks and soil can occur following two different regimes that we saw before. So this is a typical behavior of a brittle deformation regimes, in which we have a first phase in which the bonds, grain to grains, are loaded but not breaking. So we have an initial elastic phase in which all the deformation can be recovered once the stress is reducing to zero, of course. The second phase is an elastic phase in which the weakest or most intensively stressed bonds begins to break. So we can have a permanent deformation that could be not recovered if we decrease the deviatoric stress. After that, we have a rupture. So many bonds have been broken and shear surface will develop until we reach a residual steady state phase in which the deformation can occur even without increase in stress. The other type of deformation they pointed out is a sort of ductile deformation regime, in which the first two phases is more or less the same already presented, but the third phase is related to the material at high confining pressure. It means in depth in the slope, in which the material is not able to sustain increase in load, but at the same time cannot strain weaken. So it deformed without increment of stresses. So in natural slope, most geological material can display both forms of deformation, depending, of course, on confining pressure, as we see before. At great depth, the behavior can be described, according to the authors, as a transitional phase. So they introduce a new phase of deformation that can occur in this way. So this is a transitional deformation regime that could occur at deep in the slope. So we have the first two phases the same, but they introduce a pseudo-critical state in which the main deformation mechanism is the growth of multiple of pervasive microcracks. So we have a microcracks that start to create and merge each other in order to create a continuous rupture phase failure. In this case, the deformation is in a stable state at constant stress, of course, as we say. The other, of course, the other phase is a brittle phase in which the coalescence of microcracks leads to the formation of a continuous shear surface. So in this case, brittle failures occurs. Then the final phase is when strain weakening ends with the complete development of a shear plane, and so the deformation can continue without any further stress regime changes. So at the end, they state that in this type of regime, deformation regimes, the catastrophic failures is the result of the accumulation of strain and could not a result of changes in the stress state of the landslide system, considering the wall slope. And this means that the sudden failure can occur from a steady state condition if the threshold of strain is reached. So we can have also a failure without the stress increase. Now I would like to show you very briefly, because one of the unsolved questions is the inventory of this type of landslide, because it's very difficult to detect. This is the first attempt that was made in the Alps by Gerhard Haber, that was another German scientist in the 1954. He mapped the largest landslide in the Alps consider a landslide larger than 1 million cubic meter with the position larger than 0.1 square kilometer. So here is the Flims landslide I showed you before. Then the Köfel is, you see the red dots are landslide in crystalline domain, and the green one are landslide in sedimentary rocks. So you see that in crystalline domain is very few large rock fail, large landslide. And the Vaillon landslide is see very small. So now, I would like to summarize something, but yes, this is just to summarize what we already state. But there are some unsolved questions that is still good to be investigated. I mean, the regional distribution of this landslide, the failure mechanism, the triggering causes, and the temporal occurrence and the evolution of this type of landslide, the style of activities, and above all, the influence of tectonics and geology on this landslide, and so on. So I would like to briefly show you some case study, mainly in the central and western Alps, and mainly in the Dolomites, in which we can see how different stage of slope, evolutionary stage of slope can coexist in the same slope. Here is one of the most important landslides occurred recently in Italy. The Valpola landslide is about 40 million of cubic meters of material. You see here, it's very clear, see the scarp and the forming mass in this case. And here is the landslide occurred and dam the valley. If we look at the source area, I mean here, we can see the influence of tectonic structure. I mean, some 3 families of discontinuity, 1, 2, and 3 is the back surface. So in this case, the volume was delimited by tectonic structures. And this is the landslide blocked, and it's quite interesting to see here the trees pushed back from the air in front of the sliding mass. This means that the sliding mass slide at a very high velocity against the opposite slope. This is another very famous landslide, I mean the violent landslide that is maybe all of you already know. Yes, here is the date is not correct, but in any case it's 1963. Oops, what's happened? Here, okay. And here is the slope after the landslide. You see clearly the deformation, the sliding surface is according to the bedding planes. So the geology is very important in this case. Of course, here is an aerial photograph before the landslide. You see the lake and the dam was already constructed, and after the landslide, the red lines delimitate the area affected by the water wave caused by the landslide when he jumped on the reservoir. Here is a very famous photographs taken by the US Army the day after. You see that in this case, the accumulation is in steady state, so we don't have any other type of deformation on this case. But if we go from these aerial photographs, we can see here the landslide accumulation. Is very interesting to see a small creek here that is cutted by the landslide and shifted 400 meters ahead. This means that the mass does not, into the mass, does not occur many deforming phases, but only along, the deforming phases is only along the shear plane. And here is another very nice view. You see here the creek, and the points after the landslide occurred was this. And many people ask why this slab of slope didn't fail. So this is what is important, that here we have a fault that delimitate on the western side the landslide. And in this part of the slope, the attitude of the strata is exactly opposite of this. This is according to slope, this is this is the opposite. So the strata is inclined towards the slope. This is why it didn't fail. And so we also did some investigation with drill borehole here inside, and no movement still occur in this part. Other similar landslide in the Alps is the Monte Pizzi landslide that caused this lake. And here we have this type of slab of rock that is still there. And in this case, the situation is the same. I mean, we have the shear basin plane that is according to the bedding planes. So we are still monitoring this because it's quite serious situation if this part could move and down. Yes, this is another type of landslide, but I would like to go directly into the last one of the last one. This is another landslide, complex landslide. It's a rock slide here, sustained by a big, thick layer of limestones that collapsed in 1814 and causing a rock avalanche, killing 250 people. So here we have a normal fault, so the importance of the tectonics and the geology is very evident in this case. You see how the rocks is fracturing in this case. Here I would like to go to the last cases. Here another, the last cases very quickly. Here is the typical Dolomite landscape. It's very, very nice landscape in which we have, in the upper part, we have a thick wall of Dolomites, and in the gentle slope, we have a sort of ductile formation. But what is happened that also landslide can occur in this phase. 3 years ago, a big landslide occurred in this phase, in this slope, and so this was the effect during winter time. A very fast mud flow. Please look at this village. And here is this village is not involved, but after that it was the situation. And this is, I think, the last one in which we have a very clear lateral spread phenomena. You see here a big plateau of rock after line on ductile formations, and so here is what is at the beginning of the evolutionary in the upper part, and at the end of the evolution in the lower part we have this block tilting and toppling and so on. So another case, very, very well known. We are studying this and monitoring this, and the induced flow in the lower part. We're monitoring still now this type of. So, going to the final remarks, sorry for the... We usually show a transitional phase from a stable state to collapse in every slope. And every slope has its own evolutionary history. This history depends on the past processes acting on such a slope and on its primary features or intrinsic characteristics, of course. Every slope experiences the formation processes before failure. In other words, ductile behavior usually precedes brittle ones. But ductile and brittle behavior can coexist in the same times in different places of an unstable slope. But as the information from basal shear zone is very difficult to obtain, the analysis of morphological features as well as the geological structures characteristics of the slope can be the only way we have in order to infer the presence of large-scale landslide and somehow derive the style of activities and possible future scenarios. So thank you for your kind attention, and sorry for